Welcome back everybody to this video. So we are going to be talking today about the FANATIC range from the Army Painter, the FANATIC WARPAINTS range. Now this range is going to be replacing their old WARPAINTS range. Now whatever you think about the old WARPAINTS range, I've used them in lots of videos before. You've seen me use them lots and lots, but I think that it's probably right to say that the old range was getting a little bit tired, and I think that it did need an update, especially with the quality of the speed paints and the WARPAINTS Air range. So it's really exciting that they've brought out this new range of paints. Now I'm recording this in late December and this video will drop in January time, and I think the paint set itself, or these paints, will drop around March time from my understanding. So they are coming soon, but hopefully this will give you some information kind of about the background of the paints, but also particularly with a focus on the flexible triad system. And then at the end of the video, we'll also talk about why that's particularly useful for the Horus Heresy. Now, paints, I think, it's often quite complex, isn't it? You know, picking a paint, knowing which paint to pick, whether you should pick paints for their colors, for their consistency, for their coverage, for the ability to glaze, yada yada yada. Let's face it, there are loads of paints out there, and knowing which ones to buy is sometimes quite tricky. As well as that, having the accessibility to some paints as well. You know, Chimera paints are famously very, very hard to get your hands on. Even if you like a highly pigmented paints, they're not easy to get hold of always. But one thing I would say about the Army Painter is that they are relatively straightforward to get a hold of, and most hobby shops have them in. So having these new high quality paints being easily accessible at a reasonable price point is quite an exciting prospect. And I think one thing I would say is that in my job as a commission painter, I use all kinds of paints. I don't just use the Army Painter paints, of course. I use all kinds of paints. But having used the FANATIC sets, I can say that they are a top quality brand of paints that are going to be able to compete with Scale, Vallejo, aka Games Workshop. So let's have a look at what the Army Painter have said about the WARPAINTS range and kind of what they are offering. So they've said, what if the perfect miniature paint did exist? We know that's impossible, but that didn't stop us from trying. Designed to deliver unsurpassed coverage while being incredibly easy to use, featuring intense pigmentation and a flexible colour triad system, WARPAINTS FANATICs are the new gold standard for miniature paints. So I would agree with everything that they've said there. The coverage on these paints are amazing, and the flexible colour triad system is, and we will talk about that more in a moment, is really useful, because basically what they've done, they've made colour idiot proof. That's essentially, you know, you can boil it down into that phrase. They have made colour idiot proof. They've made choosing schemes for your painting idiot proof, and they have made your highlighting idiot proof through the system that they've kind of developed with the FANATICs range. Some of the things that they do pride themselves on, though, with this new range is, and I think what's particularly useful, is the practical colour naming. Now, you might think, oh, well, that's not that important, and, you know, you might think, oh, well, you know, I can tell another colour from another. But sometimes, actually, when you've got 20 different purples in front of you, knowing exactly what kind of purple it is often very useful, and knowing whether there's some blues in there, knowing whether there's, you know, whether it's a magenta purple, etc. Actually, that's very, very useful to know. And then on top of that, the coverage on these paints, the pigmentation, is really, really excellent as well. But this is what they've said about their paints. Let's have a look though at what I've done with some of their paints. So this is just some of the things that I have created with the WARPAINTS FANATIC range. Now, these guys were done several months ago, so if you follow me, you will know that actually I did this project ages and ages ago. But Army Painter sent me around 12 paints, I think, and they were a pretty eclectic mix of colours. You know, I had oranges and yellows and a couple of flesh paints as well within there, but nothing that kind of linked to the triad system itself. But I was able to, using the paints, create this cloak and then the head on this sergeant as well. So you can see here, you know, and I think particularly with the flesh, how smooth the paint is. And just from my experience, you can mix them really, really nicely, and they are highly pigmented as well. So let's get into some of the technicalities of these paints. So it's an interesting phrase, triads or triadic colours. So this is definitely a phrase that's been used by paint companies more and more often over the past couple of years. But in art, triadic colours actually mean something different to what we might understand as kind of that base, mid, highlight. So triadic colours refers to 3 colours chosen on a colour wheel that are equidistant from one another. So you can see here where we've got the picture of this X-Men, Cyclops I think it's called. You've got red, yellow and blue, and they've come together in a painting that is quite bold, quite poppy, and the reason for that is because of the colours that have been selected. So a triadic colours or triad colours are essentially hues of colours. The hue is just a colour on a colour wheel that are equidistant from one another, or equidistant on that colour wheel. So this is what, in painting, in art, this is what we would refer to a triadic colour. But it is different from what companies have been using for kind of describe what triads are. So you can see here what most kind of paint companies would actually refer to a triad. And a triad is a base, a midtone and a highlight. So they stay within the same hue, but the values change of the colour, the brightness changes, or you know, the colours get brighter as you go from base, midtone, highlight. Now that isn't, I say brighter, and I'm going to caveat that in a moment, because it's not always as simple as that. But essentially, you have a natural progression between the colours that you're choosing to highlight something. And you can see here that the Army Painter aren't just the only company that do this. So Tooth and Coats is also a company that kind of focuses on that triad. Now, what the Army Painter have done though is create something called a flexible triad. And this is their flexible triad system. Now, they have a great video on their YouTube channel kind of describing this flexible triad system and trialing it out on a cloak. But I'm just going to do my bit and trying to explain it for you. So essentially, the flexible triad system is that you have a hue, a colour, and then from that base colour, you have 5 colours that are tints of that colour. Okay, so you can see here, you've got the triumphant navy colour, gothic blue, ultramarine blue, alpha blue, baron blue and augur blue. And essentially these are tints on that original hue, on that triumphant navy, where it might be that they're just adding white to a colour to get a natural progression. Now where this comes in handy particularly is where we are layering. So when we're layering with colours like this, if we think about Power Sword for example, what it does is it allows us to get a natural gradient, so the transitions are nice and smooth. We could use glazing in between those transitions, but actually having kind of 6 paints where the progression is quite natural is really, really useful, especially if we're not too familiar with glazing, or you know, we might need to practice glazing. However, the one thing I would say about the flexible triad system is that it's not just as simple, and I think my hat's off to the Army Painter guys for this. It's not just as simple as going, oh, these paints get brighter, or they're different tints on the hue colour. And a good example of this is vibrant greens. So let's take Emerald Forest. So if you can imagine, you got that colour, and if we just added white to it, Emerald Forest would not end up looking like that end colour, which would be Afterglow. No way would you ever get Emerald Forest to, you know, add white to it to be Afterglow. So something else is happening here, which is that also within these kind of these triads, or within these 6 colours, they're also playing around with shifting the hues as well. And vibrant greens is a good example of this, because if you add white to a colour or add grey to a colour, you essentially desaturate it, which is what pastel colours are. You know, you're just adding white to a colour. But in order to maintain the vibrancy of these colours, they've shifted the hue as the paints have gone along. So actually what they've done is that they've added yellow into the paint, as well as adding probably a bit of white into it as well. And what that does is it maintains vibrancy. So you might be thinking, oh, okay, well, you know, why don't I just buy, you know, Emerald Forest and just add white to it, and then, you know, it saves me buying, you know, these 6 different colors. It's not as simple as that, because actually what they've done is, in order to maintain some of the vibrancy on these colors, they've also added in additional colors as well. So I think that's also important to note. So where some colors are just tints on an original color, on an original hue, some of them are not. Some of them are shifting in their vibrancy. And you can see the flexible triad system that they've got here. And the other thing about the flexible triad system, which I think is great, is that, let's say you want to highlight a tank. You know, you could go, well, I quite like my miniatures to be dark and gritty, so I'm going to choose Triumphant Navy, Gothic Blue, and Ultramarine Blue. So 1, 2, and 3. But you might be somebody who goes, you know what, I want my models to be within the same hue of those colours there, but actually I want them to pop a little bit more on the tabletop. And in order for that to happen, I need to use some lighter colours. I need to use some tints on that original hue that I quite like. So actually I'm going to choose 3, 4, and 5. I'm going to choose Ultramarine Blue, Alpha Blue, Baron Blue. So they still stay within the same hue, but they're just tints on that colour in that example. And the same can be said for Emerald Forest. Yeah, you might say, well, I want a Salamander's miniature to be painted, yeah, in Emerald Forest and highlighted with leafy green and a final highlight of Rainforest. But you might be someone who goes, I really want them to pop on the tabletop, so you might start at leafy green, Rainforest, electric line. But the whole point around this system is that you can choose 3 colours and there'll be a natural progression. And if you want to maximise the contrast within it, you could go Emerald Forest, Rainforest, and then Afterglow. You can actually jump between them as well if you want to maximise contrast. So you're jumping some of the progression, but that would also mean that there's a leap between some colours. But the most important thing is that they same within the same or a similar hue, which I think is unlike anything that I've seen kind of too much, and certainly novel and new, and is going to be really useful, I think, to painters. So what I want to do now is take you guys through a good example of where I think the flexible triad system kind of comes into play, but essentially how you can see it working. And I think a great example of this is with Horus Heresy legions, because not all Sons of Horus schemes are the same. Some people like teals, some people just like desaturated greens, and some people just like, a fairly normal olive green or whatever. Okay, your word bearers out there really range from a warm red to cool reds, those ideas of being kind of like almost like a purplish burgundy colour. What this flexible triad system allows you to do is to not only kind of look at the different kinds of colours that you might want your legion to be, but also then what tint or hue that you might want it to be as well. So let's take word bearers as an example of this. So I'm sure you guys have seen lots of different kinds of word bearers colour schemes before, but I've certainly seen them within the warm reds as well as the cool reds. So within the warm reds, I would not have my word bearers around the Sacred Scarlet, Violet and Raging Rouge. I wouldn't have them there, but I certainly would consider having it a Resplendent Red and Angelic Red, and then maybe a final highlight with Legendary Red. If you, though, want to go down the cooler red route, and by that, what we're saying is that the reds are moving away from the warmer section of the colour wheel to the cooler section, so we're now heading towards and have more purples within our reds, then this might be an option for you. So you can see here, actually, this is a great tool to be able to unpick what scheme that you might want your kind of legion to be. So starting from a Basilisk Red, then highlighted with Wyvern, then a final highlight of Dragon Red, I think would be a great choice for word bearers. But I wouldn't then go to pure red, for example, or Blood Chalice of Raging Rose. I think that at that point I would stop at Dragon Red being my final highlight, for example. So it's quite cool having this system, the flexible triad system, to be able to go, actually, what kinds of reds do I want? And I think this links back to right at the start, what we were saying, which was that you've got the naming conventions, and you've got these quite abstract naming conventions, which is Basilisk Red, and not really knowing what that means, and Dragon Red, and not really knowing what that means, but knowing, and on the bottle written, that this is a cool red is actually really, really useful to be able to kind of unpick and understand colours. Now, I'm not saying that this will necessarily impact directly your painting, but it will help you, I think, this process, understand kind of like colour theory a little bit better, understand what colours you're dealing with. And I think personally, from a painter's point of view, that's quite cool. Understanding why you're choosing a colour, I think, is something quite cool. And I think the flexible triad system just lends itself towards that. So let's have a look here at our Alpha Legion. So Alpha Legion could fall within the turquoises, it could fall within the deep green blues, and you could even say it could fall under the vivid blues as well. So any one of those would be appropriate for Alpha Legion, and then you would have to decide the kind of tint that you would want from that original hue. So you can see here with our turquoises, I wouldn't have thought, so looking at these colours, the lightness is that they probably, with Deep Azure, Hydro Turquoise, added white into it to create those tints. They may have added additional colours in, but looking at it, it just looks like a natural progression on the, a natural tint on the original hue. And then you can then choose, how bright, how dark you want your Alpha Legion to be. Do you want it to be at this end of the Aquamarine, Neptune Glow and Marine Mist, or do you want it to be Deep Azure to Turquoise Siren? You might even feel 3 is too many. You might just go, I want it Hydro Turquoise highlighted with Turquoise Siren, or Hydro Turquoise highlighted with Aquamarine, for example. You just want to keep it simple and go with 2 colours. Okay. So Alpha Legion is a great example where we can kind of play with some of the colours that we've got here, but also deep green blues would be a great one for Alpha Legion. Let's have a look at salamanders, so a legion after my own heart here. So salamanders are interesting because I think that you could fit them under the vibrant green category. So I quite like my salamanders. In fact, I like all my legions to be quite vibrant, so they pop on the tabletop. But even looking at this colour plate here, that this is not reflective of most of the artwork of salamanders. I just like vibrant greens because they pop. But lots of you might go, actually, I want it to be deep green, kind of almost like that forest green, angel green, guardian green, green skin, for example. And that would be a much more natural progression for me. And some of you might even go, what, I want to play around with desaturated cool greens, just depending on the, I'm thinking of maybe like a traitor salamanders, right? Something like that. And you can play around with these colours, but there's also nothing stopping you from mixing in and out of these colours as well. I think it's important to say, mixing having Ancient Green and then highlight it with Medieval Forest, for example. So I'm going to stick this over to vibrant greens only because I like them to be vibrant, but you might think about, for yours, doing deep greens. Let's have a look at Night Lords. So Night Lords is a great example of a colour that is actually quite difficult to get right, I think. So I would be tempted to go down the vivid blue route for Night Lords. I want their colours to be quite punchy. I might make their highlights though very, very tight. But you might want to, in your base colour, add a little bit of purple, to simulate the night, I guess. I think when I think of Night Lords, I'm thinking almost like a purple blue. So, I could add some Terrestrial Titan in with the Imperial Navy as my base colour and then go to my Regal Blue highlight. What I probably wouldn't do though, is go down the route of going to a strong pale blue. So I'd more associate that with, say, Ultramarines, for example, than I would with Night Lords. Night Lords, I still want some vividness to the blue. Emperor's Children is a great example here of understanding the hues of your colour. So typically, early Emperor's Children, the Great Crusade era, you would stick within the Terrestrial Triton, Alien Purple, Cultist Purple, kind of, you would stick within this hue here. Those are typically, the purples. When we think of purple, this is the kind of like the purple that we think of. However, you could go over to this section over here, so the pinks and the magentas, to be kind of like a later version, a Horus Heresy kind of era version of your Emperor's Children. You know, typically magentas or would be ones to consider, but also you've got these wild pinks that you could use as well. And actually, much of the artwork, much of the Black Library novels, you have Emperor's Children described as pink, but this allows you to have a look and understand the colours and select them appropriately, and then select what kind of tint that you might want on that particular hue. Space Wolves, over to the black and greys. However, if you're doing a more 40k based force, you might go over to the desaturated blue greys, and you might stick within the wolf grey, runic cobalt, and forest blue. So you might go higher up on those tints. Sons of Horus. Well, lots of you are going to obviously go towards the teal. But probably not towards the turquoise. I think the turquoise is essentially 2 blue, 2 Alpha Legion, but certainly something around the teal section or the desaturated cool greens would be appropriate for Sons of Horus. Blood Angels. So Blood Angels, I would definitely stick around the warm reds, so somewhere around here, Resplendent Red. But if I'm looking at a cool red, I might start at the pure red, Blood Chalice, and then Raging Rose. So that's an interesting one, depending on where we might start on that kind of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 progression. Ultramarines, if you want them more vivid, I would always kind of tend to go towards more vivid. I would stick around here, something like Crystal Blue, Arctic Gem. But you could also go towards this strong pale blues and go towards your Ultramarine blue, something like Gothic Blue, Ultramarine Blue, and then Alpha Blue as well. So what you can see here, and I think why this is so useful, particularly to Legion players, as well as, I understand there'll be lots of Space Marine players from 40k maybe watching this as well, but I think this is just a great tool for understanding kind of colour theory, for understanding your hues, for selecting a hue that is appropriate for your Legion in your vision for the Legion as well. So I think that, Horus Heresy players, and speaking as a Horus Heresy player myself, you guys in particular are going to benefit from this. Now, what we're going to move to next is I'm going to show you some of these Legions painted, just airbrushed with some of these colours. But I will come more towards the airbrushing and the technical element of the painting in later videos. So I'll do a video about airbrushing specifically. I'll do an airbrush about glazing, etc., etc. Putting the paints through their paces. But just to show you what these paints are capable of, I will, at the end of this video, put some Marines that have been painted with these colours. Just airbrushed, not completed, just airbrushed. I hope that's been useful for you guys. I hope it's all made sense as well. And I look forward to seeing you on the next one. And this is your first time watching these videos. Make sure that you hit the like button. Make sure that you subscribe. And you can always share it with your friends and family who might enjoy this video as well. Take care, guys, and I shall see you on the next one.